Welcome to the Titans of Industry show. I have a phenomenal guest on for everyone today. This is a very special interview for myself, for this channel, and I am very excited to have Dr. Robert Spalding. If you don't know Robert, please go to the Valuetainment interview he did with Pat David, a phenomenal interview that Patrick decided to do after reading his book, Robert's book, and seeing how phenomenal the resource that is General Spalding to the public, to the American public. I am very excited to have him on today because we have such a limited time. If you want to know more about Robert, I suggest you go to his website. You look the Valuetainment interview because they went and talked a lot about his background and what he did. But for our limited time, I would love to just jump in and speak with him about his experiences and his insights. Robert, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you. Great to be here, and in Tel Aviv and in DC.
Yeah, certainly. You know, both of us military men. I did 3 years that is mandatory. Definitely not something that Americans have to do or choose to do. Very differently than here. You're getting enlisted whether you like it or not at 18, and it's very different circumstances. I wanted to really ask you to start with, how many people, if I was to take a survey, how many people, is it in the hundreds, in the thousands, that have the same life experience, they have the same expertise, knowledge? How many people are like General Robert Spalding, and would you assume in the tens, in the hundreds, in the thousands? How many other people are like you?
Well, in terms of my career path, I would say that I'm probably the only one because, I was in the B-2 program, flying B-2s for the Air Force, and I decided to go to China. Now, subsequently, we've had some other B-2 pilots go to not China, they went to Taiwan. So there are some other B-2 pilots that speak Chinese, but I don't think there's any that speak Chinese. And then I've also gotten a PhD in economics. So I think I have a diverse set of skill sets that China kind of came together by happenstance, not really anything directly of my own doing, kind of more luck, I would say, and blessings. So I've been very fortunate to have a unique career in the Air Force.
Robert, you spent a lot of time in China. You're a China expert. What are the fundamental ways in which the United States of America and China are different? And what are the ways that people, overlook and think, man, we're so different, China and the United States? What are some of the ways that we're actually very similar between China and the United States?
So I lived in China, in Shanghai, from 2002 to 2004, and I spoke the language because I'd spent a year at the Defense Language Institute learning Mandarin, and traveled all over the country. I studied at Tongji University in Shanghai. I was there with my wife and two sons. They were ages 4 and 7 at the time. And it was just an incredible place. And I really got to know the people, the culture, the history, geography, really what it was like to live in China and really embrace the Chinese people. And I fell in love with the country. I fell in love with the people and the culture and everything. So, in terms of the people, I would say that Chinese people are like American people, are just like people everywhere. I think people are people. And they have a lot of the same interests. They want to raise a family. They want to have a job. They want to feel like, that they're going places and their kids are going to have a better life than they will. So it's really about opportunity. And I think in a lot of ways, a lot of Chinese people think that they have great opportunity, or at least did back in 2002 to 2004. And when I left in 2004, I was so excited about the country and where things were going and headed, that I told my wife I wanted to move back after I was retired from the Air Force and start a business and really have a second career, just working in and around China. I would say that, later on, when the Air Force decided to send me back to be the defense attaché and senior defense official in China, I started really working on understanding the government and the party. And in order to understand China, you have to understand that, most things that you see in China, you see through the lens that the Chinese Communist Party wants you to see it through. And really, if you were going to take China and explain it to somebody, that you really need to break it up into the party, the country, and the people. So I already told you about the people. The country is, large, diverse geography. It's got the People's Republic of China government that looks, for the most part, like a standard, developed country government. They have laws and they have institutions. But then you have the party, and the party is really the thing that I think is so interesting, because it's so very unique in that it is pervasive in terms of its reach and power, but it's very, very misunderstood. Most people don't understand the Chinese Communist Party. And so where the United States, the citizens actually, the government derives its power from the citizens. The Constitution actually says any power is not given to the government, the federal government. The states and the people retain all rights and power unto themselves. And in China, the party is the all-powerful element. So in the United States, the Constitution is law. In China, the Communist Party is law. So if you think about it in terms of a governing structure, it's very much like America was prior to the Revolutionary War. We were subjects of the King of England, and the King of England can do with his subjects as he pleased. Chinese people are really subjects of the Chinese Communist Party, and you don't understand that until you begin to see the brutality with which the Chinese Communist Party treats its people. And one of the biggest things that I think that really demonstrates that is the forced organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience. And uniquely, it was actually Israel that was the first to stand up and say, to ban travel to China for transplants, because what was happening is they were taking essentially dissidents and killing them for their organs, and that they were selling on the global market. So it is a very, very different government that's run by a party that controls all, that essentially treats the Chinese people as subjects. And certainly, if you're not doing anything that angers the party or creates problems for the party, like participating in religious services or otherwise creating problems for China, the party's continued rule, you can live a great life in China, have a home, a job, take care of your kids, really. So that's where this social contract that the Chinese Communist Party has with the people is: we will deliver you employment and opportunity, and you will basically allow us to subjugate you. So it's really a unique a governing structure in our current global order, and one that really is not well understood.
That is really fascinating, truly. And I have a few follow-up questions to that. But before I do, I want to ask you this. On a daily basis, people go about their lives, they get up, they go to work, etc. How much manpower, how much money, how much resources, effort on a daily basis between all of these federal agencies in the United States and in China, how much is there already war? Not physical war, but the rest of it, intelligence, everything and anything that goes on behind the scenes on a daily basis. How many people are focused on China is the enemy, or the United States is my enemy, etc. And is this just the United States and China, or are we talking about all of the other big countries having some part in this grand chess match?
So, I mean, that is really so. In terms of the United States, you would have said prior to the first quarter of 2018, nobody in any part of the government was doing anything against China. In fact, it was just the opposite. We were trying to help China grow and to become more powerful because we felt that if they became wealthy, that they would eventually liberalize politically. They would democratize. So, up until first quarter of 2018, 100% of the federal government, of the United States federal government, was tasked with promoting the growth and increased economic and science and technology and unfortunately military power of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's the facts. In terms of the other way around, if you look at war in terms of ships and planes and tanks and bombs, then I would say nobody in China was dedicated to that. If you look at war in terms of trade and economics and finance and politics and media and the internet, then I would say most of China was engaged in that, but not engaged in that in a way that they said, okay, I'm doing this purposely to destroy the United States or democracy. It would be more like, hey, I'm doing this because this is a way I can get wealthy and take care of my family. It's just that, the Chinese Communist Party structured the incentive system so that it operated in ways so that when you were doing things to make yourself wealthy, those things also led to the undermining of the U.S. economy and really democratic principles, not just in the United States, everywhere.
Now, Robert, for those who don't know, does the Communist Party in China get voted in? How did this even start? Take us back, like, I don't know, until Mao Zedong falls from power. How did this come about in China, and how did they get this way?
Well, Mao had this vision of warfare called People's War, and it was really about psychological war. It was really about media war. It was really about political warfare. So the West thinks of, Clausewitz writes, war is politics by other means. Mao would say that politics is war by other means. And so, the Nationalist Party chased the communists into the wilderness, and they were all but defeated. And they didn't have the resources, either monetarily or military-wise, or the training to fight directly the Nationalist Party, who was in charge of China after the end of the Qing dynasty, and then basically led China during World War II. Of course, a lot of what FDR did was to try to get the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party to jointly fight the Japanese. And in fact, the Communist Party under Mao basically fought the Nationalist Party while the Nationalist Party fought the Japanese. So at the end of World War II, the Nationalist Party was significantly weakened because of the war it was fighting with Japan. At the same time, what the Communist Party had been doing was essentially propagandizing and indoctrinating the people in the countryside. And so they raised a peasant army and then slowly began to erode the political influence of the Nationalist Party until their power was enough, and then a weakened Nationalist Party could not defeat them. And of course, to add insult to injury for Chiang Kai-shek, the United States essentially abandoned the Nationalist Party, and so the Chinese Communist Party was able to win a revolutionary war, dominate the mainland. The Nationalist Party went to Taiwan, and then the Chinese Communist Party essentially ruled China as a dictatorship, and they still do today. And I think we knew during the Cold War what kind of nation or regime the Chinese Communist Party was. I think there was this belief with the death of Mao and the rise of Deng Xiaoping that they would essentially liberalize. And in fact, all they did was essentially take the innovation, technology, and talent and capital from the West in order to grow strong, so that they could then, come out and do the things that they're doing today.
That's very interesting. And in light of that, in light of how centric they are and how they want to just control anything that they can on a national level, why aren't they pursuing their own currency agenda? Why are they not raising any voices publicly, at least, that hey, we have the dollar ruling the currency universe. It's obviously a very important part of who dominates politics and geopolitics on a global level. Why aren't they looking for a replacement on their end, or are they?
Well, so the dollar has not led to geopolitical outcomes at international institutions like the UN or the WTO or the World Health Organization or UN Human Rights Council or the World Bank for a long time. It's actually more about trade. And in trade, China has a tremendous advantage in that it pursues a export-led economy in terms of trade. And it pursues dominance of the global supply chain, but it has a closed financial system. And so the renminbi doesn't trade on a market. And so, usually when you have trade that's so one-sided, there's a countervailing currency trade that tends to rise, in the case of the US and China trade, for example, exports, coming from China year after year would cause a lot of currency to go to China year after year, which would tend to, rise, would tend to cause the prices of Chinese goods to rise, which would then lead to a more balanced trade. But because the Chinese system is a closed financial system, they have a non-convertible currency. Those currency flows then get cashed in to the Chinese government, and then they turn around and use that cash to buy hard assets. And so they've been able to carry on this multi-decade trade imbalance because there's no currency leveling mechanism. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have today is not only that, but also access that Chinese companies have to Western capital markets to raise hard currency on equity markets and bond markets.
Really interesting. COVID-19, obviously the most important topic on everybody's minds right now. What is the impact of that on China-US relations? If you look at YouTube and just media in general, there's a lot of hatred towards China right now. Is this something that you think will be a political tool for President Trump? You think that talking about will defeat China, etc., winning a war against China, blaming China, is this more of a political stunt to win over voters, or is this real? And what I'm asking basically is, does President Xi look at Trump and say, okay, he's not really talking about this, is not serious stuff, he's not threatening us, this is more of a just a political campaign stuff, and how much of it is real, basically, is what I'm asking.
Well, so I think, first of all, it's not China, it's the Chinese Communist Party. So it's clear that the Chinese Communist Party created the pandemic. I'm not talking here about, whether or not the virus was created in a lab or occurred naturally. They created the spread of the virus. That was deliberate actions by the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. So yes, there's a lot of anger towards the Chinese Communist Party, but in terms of the end result, I don't know if you saw that TSMC just announced they're going to put a new $14 billion fab in Arizona, and you're going to see microelectronics supply chain come back to the United States. You're going to see a lot of the things that are made in China 2025 actually be instantiated in a manufacturing sense in the United States. Now, did coronavirus caused this to happen? No, it was already happening. It's part of the national security strategy that came out in December of 2017. And I should know, I was the architect of it. No, it's what the coronavirus has done is actually accelerate the implementation of what was already a strategy to decouple the United States economically from China because of the danger it posed not only to our industrial base, but also to our economy, and through jobs, through the loss of jobs, our society.
Robert, I think this all begs the question, what is China's main goal? What is their end game for the United States?
So the Chinese Communist Party's end goal is to remain in control of China. And in order to remain in control of China, they must maintain their parasitic nature, the parasitic nature of their economy. In other words, they must extract innovation, technology, talent, and capital, but they cannot allow the transfer of democratic principles or universal human rights. And so they want to continue to grow the economy without giving up their right to oppress the Chinese people. That's what the Chinese Communist Party ultimately want. And in order to effectuate that, they have to be predatory or parasitic in terms of the way they run their economy, but also they have to suppress the expression of democratic principles outside their borders for fear that the Chinese people might become infected with these ideas. And so the Great Firewall, 100% control over Chinese language media, both in the country and outside the country, really the total dominance of technology today with regard to the ability to mine data and then turn that data into intelligence and influence. These are the areas that the Chinese Communist Party is pursuing and being quite successful in. You know, Silicon Valley built a very successful technology and business model around harvesting and mining data. That technology and business model has been fully adopted and instantiated in China. You know, 4G was dominated by the United States. The two major platforms, iOS and Android, were American companies. You know, 5G is really going to be about the future of machine to machine and man to machine, and really using data to track and influence the society. This is the domain that China has chosen to dominate, and they're currently dominating inside their borders. And in terms of the telco industry, the network equipment providers, the two dominant ones, Huawei and ZTE, are coming from China because why? They want access to data. Kai-Fu Lee, the leading artificial intelligence researcher in China, says that China is to data as Saudi Arabia is to oil. They want to dominate the data of the 21st century because they believe that that's the oil, because it drives artificial intelligence and it drives the information economy. That's their goal. Their targets right now, their crosshairs are on Facebook, Amazon, and Google. It's really about dominating the next era of information technology and apps and services and business models so that they can dominate the information economy, but also be dominant in terms of influence around the globe.
How close are they to achieving such goals? And basically what I'm asking you, Robert, is are we looking at a situation where more countries in the future will look more like China, or will this be contained to, are they winning their pursuit? I'm asking you this because I want to know what's going on inside of China. The average person, does he not look to revolt? Does he think that, hey, I'm just one person against an all-powerful government? Why is there not a bigger, it's 1.5 billion people. I assume the government is much less in terms of like the numbers, etc. And push comes to shove, are they a country that has a military that has no issues filling hard orders, difficult orders, like orders like shoot citizens, etc. How is this country ethnically created? Are they not united? Are they not the same? Are the soldiers not from families that actually resist this sort of governance? How is it to be inside of China?
Well, so I mean, if you're ever since the Tiananmen massacre, the Chinese Communist Party realized that they had to be much better at the ideological sphere within the country, and so they instituted mandatory indoctrination at all grade levels. They changed the media system. They changed they created the Great Firewall. So for the most part, the Chinese people are fed one narrative, and that's the narrative that the Chinese Communist Party wants them to hear. Are there protests? Yes, but you can read Harvard Business Studies where, or Harvard University studies that talk about, you can dissent in China, you just can't have collective dissent because they've structured their ability to censor social media platforms to prevent viral dissent from happening. So they're the most highly sophisticated technology-based dictatorship in the world, and they're very effective at what they do. And so I don't see that they're fragile at all. I actually think that they're quite strong, and they're particularly strong if we continue to give them the innovation, technology, talent, and capital they need to remain strong. I think once we begin to cut those things off, and you begin to see the impact in the Chinese economy, you're going to begin to see the impact in the Chinese society. Now, all that being said, you have places like North Korea and Cuba that have been dictatorships for a long time and don't seem to be in any mood to change anytime soon. And in that, clearly the people aren't treated well. So, I think the Chinese Communist Party can last quite a long time. I think it's more important to understand what are the implications for democracies if you so fully enmesh yourself or relate yourself to the Chinese Communist Party. If they are in your academia, they're in your think tanks, in your corporate sector, in your financial sector, if they're in your infrastructure, if they're all in your government and institutions, then you're going to have a problem maintaining your own national interests, because every time they come into conflict with Chinese national interests, your national interests are going to lose out because they have essentially deputized proxies in your nation that work on their behalf and essentially echo their narrative.
Dr. Spalding, many people that have never visited China, what they envision, if you ask them, hey, what is China like? They envision rice paddies, people that are living on $2 a day, slave laborers in the hundreds of millions, no access to electricity, no access to phones. They think of extreme poverty. On the flip side, you're hearing about magnetic levitation trains that take people 20 minutes to go to work, where work is 300, 400 kilometers away. Obviously, you look at the big cities. What is the difference between the perception of China and what China is really like?
Well, I think you can go to, China's a big place. And certainly there are places where the people are very, very poor, and do live on very minimal subsistence wages. And then there's places with very high technology. The coastal areas are relatively rich. The inland areas are relatively poor. So there is more below the median income than there is above the median income, definitely. But at the end of the day, the Communist Party rules, according to their own interests, and so it is a harsh life, but it's also for many, for hundreds of millions that are in the middle class, it's also a pretty good life. And so you get a diversity of views depending on where you go.
That's really interesting. You said regarding COVID-19 that the Chinese party sabotaged some of the information and early on. What are some of the things that they did deliberately that were sinister?
Well, first of all, you have to know that Xi Jinping, from his own words, said he was in charge of Wuhan on the 7th of January. Now, it just so happens that, they're coming into, on the 7th of January, the peak travel season in China. So on the 13th of January, it's reported that the Chinese Communist Party knows that they have human-to-human transmission, yet they don't close Wuhan until the 23rd of January. By that time, 5 million people have left Wuhan, according to the Wuhan mayor, to the four corners of the earth. And so, what in the United States, the president, closed, flights to and from China, but he didn't close them to and from Europe. And ultimately, that's where a lot of the infection spread in the United States from the Europeans, who were in turn infected by all those people in Wuhan. At the same time that Xi Jinping was basically ordering for block parties of 40,000 people to continue in Wuhan and travel to continue internationally, but not domestically within China, they were locking down PPE and masks and ventilators in China and abroad. And so all of a sudden in January, China turns into a net importer in protective gear instead of a net exporter, which they've traditionally been over the last couple of decades. So there's a lot of things in there to say, okay, Xi was in charge. He knew about human-to-human transmission, and he told them to go ahead and travel anyway, to let them travel. And they put pressure on the World Health Organization not to say anything, basically to look the other way. And then finally, if you want to look about the origin of the virus, although I discount it, I don't really get into it. You can see that the bat lady, Shizhen Li, was essentially collecting bat-related coronaviruses to do gain-of-function research. And this research, really led to her discovering a version of the coronavirus that was infectious to humans. And so, and they wrote a report about that. In January or February, Xi Jinping basically called for accelerated implementation of a biosafety law. And then in January, Chen Wei, the PLA Major General, was made to be the director of the P4 lab in Wuhan. So, I mean, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that the virus didn't itself come from a bat in the wet market in Wuhan, but rather escaped from the lab. In 2018, U.S. Embassy officials traveled to the Wuhan P4 lab and then sent a cable back to headquarters in D.C. saying they were concerned about safety precautions. So, pandemic definitely deliberately done by the Chinese Communist Party. Origin of the virus, we're not going to know, probably never going to know, but most probably was accidentally released from the P4 lab.
Wow, that's pretty big. And what I want to ask you is, in America, there are so many people that are critics of the mainstream media. They equate mainstream media reporting to indoctrination, or they say that, hey, there's too much government in America, etc. Americans are very critical of the way that their own government operates. Is there justification for that? Do you think that in America there has been more and more Big Brother, etc.? And is this going to continue? Is this what society is becoming in America?
Well, so I think there is media bias, and probably the main reason is because we've jumped into this 24/7 news cycle, where there's a lot less journalism, there's a lot less fact checking, and there's a lot more just sensationalism, and I think that's going to continue. My concern is that using the technologies that Silicon Valley deploys today in their business models, big data analysis, social media, and artificial intelligence bots, you can begin to create protests in nearly any city. You can begin to, anywhere in the world, create influence at the individual level. All of these things are tools that Silicon Valley developed and deployed. Essentially, the Chinese Communist Party adopted them as their main avenue for influence of societies. So they are using these tools, as are the Russians, to basically convince people things that promote Chinese Communist Party interests. For example, in March, they were sending out text messages and social media posts to American citizens in order to get them to panic because the messages said that the president was going to institute martial law. So these are the kinds of things that the Chinese Communist Party has been doing in the aftermath of the coronavirus, in addition to trying to create the perception that the United States is the source of the coronavirus. And then, and these are tools, by the way, that the Russians have used before, but the Chinese really hadn't. So this new use of wolf warrior diplomacy, this new use of social media influencing in order to create panic in the United States is something new that we haven't seen from the Chinese yet. In the United States, of course, we've seen it in Taiwan, in Malaysia, in the Philippines. And so there's a perfecting of these tools and business models that in terms of how they deploy them and use them, not just within China, but abroad. So that's going on as we speak. And I think, data security, data sovereignty, the fact that you own or control your own data and that you can't be influenced without your knowing it because the system is built that way is exactly what I envisioned and what was written into the national security strategy when it says we need a nationwide secure 5G network.
Do you personally, are you concerned with traveling to China personally on a personal level, doing these interviews and writing your book, etc.?
Yeah, I wouldn't travel to China as long as the Chinese Communist Party is involved. I think it's a dangerous place, and certainly people have ended up dead, and certain other people have ended up in prison. We've had 2 Canadians that have been in prison for over a year, and this is just on the basis of the Meng Wanzhou extradition case. So the Chinese Communist Party plays for keeps. They know what they're doing. They know how to put pressure on people, and they're more than willing to use people to get that.
Wow, that's pretty massive. How does the China-U.S. relationship impact the daily lives of Americans? Like 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, how will we say, hey, China changed this or that for the average person?
Well, today, as I wrote in my book, Roy Jones, who was a mid-level employee of the Marriott Corporation, liked to tweet about Tibet. This Tibetan dissident group had basically given praise to Marriott's website because of the way it portrayed Tibet. This person liked it. And, even though he was a mid-level employee, the Chinese Communist Party called Marriott Corporation up and said, hey, fire that guy and apologize. And of course they did. So what it's going to look like in 5 years is, your kid's not going to get into a certain school. You're not going to get a certain job. There's going to be things that happen that are outside of your ability to comprehend them, but they'll serve to slow down and make more difficult those who don't conform to what the Chinese Communist Party wants.
Yeah, of course, we saw what happened with the NBA.
So exactly, and that's another example.
Yeah, those are big things that are happening. Robert, where can people look into your books and your speeches and everything else?
I have my own YouTube channel, General Spalding. On my website is generalspalding.com. That you can find my book there. I'm on Twitter. Robert_Spalding, also on Instagram as General Spalding. So a lot of places to find me out there in social media land, and certainly the books best. You can find that on generalspalding.com.
What do you presently do for the United States government, if you're doing anything actively?
Today, I'm retired, and people call me for advice, but for the most part, I'm not employed by the government. I work in the private sector. Part of telling this story is for me a labor of love. It's really about promoting and supporting and defending the Constitution that I love and the country that I love, and I think that I also want to do that in other countries as well that are democracies that want to understand how the global world is affecting their prosperity and their sovereignty and their independence.
So, in closing, I want to ask you: there are companies, private companies, obviously private contractors, everything like that. People that have been in the military are probably exposed to technologies that the private sector doesn't have or is not allowed to deploy, etc. Things that are very advanced, and then they take that knowledge and they obviously monetize it big time in the private sector. Is that a fear? Is that going forward? Is that something that you see is problematic? Talent, people that are extremely talented from the intelligence agency, from the CIA, from everywhere else, that go and now they become real world spies, industrial spies for companies that want to know more about other companies, etc. What happened with, for example, the Harvey Weinstein, where he contracted a company which deployed spies basically to find out more about the plaintiffs, etc. Is this a problem? Is this something that you're afraid of?
Oh yeah, it's clearly happening every single day, and it's something that we have to be aware of and we have to deal with. That is the primary way that, in a lot of ways, the Chinese Communist Party gets what it wants.
Robert, thank you very much for doing this interview, and it was a pleasure and an honor to speak with you.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.
Okay, and we're off the air. Thank you very much, sir.
Absolutely. Happy to do it.
Thank you. Where are you based at right now? Obviously
I'm
not
in
London.
DC,
Okay.
right by Reagan Airport.
Okay. Is it opening there? Is it? Are you? Is it?
Not yet. Hopefully, maybe next week or the week after. I hope.
So just stay at home right now?
Yeah, pretty much.
Wow. We
Yeah.
we reopen now, but as you know, we've had other issues now with the government and everything like that. They're trying to figure who's going to be prime minister. They want to split it. So Netanyahu is going to stand for trial. So very interesting times ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, sir.
All right. Well, have a
I'm
great
gonna post
evening
it.
and great weekend.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.